Hi, everybody. As you know, I'm Marion Seaman, and tonight I have the honor of introducing Joanna Doolittle Hoppes, granddaughter of our one of the most famous members of the Adventurers Club, General Jimmy Doolittle. She was born in Japan and lived and traveled in the United States as an Air Force brat. Needless to say, that's what her father did for a living. But she always called California home. That makes us lucky tonight, right? She grew up in the Doolittle household and has written a fascinating book about her grandfather, his spectacular life in aviation, war, and the behind-the-scenes preparations for the many risks he had taken. General Doolittle, as you may recall, organized and led the famous Tokyo raid from an aircraft carrier, the Hornet, and the early stages of World War II, when the American public badly needed a morale booster. General Doolittle was the first member of this Adventurers Club to receive a Congressional Medal of Honor. That's really proud, I think. He became commanding general of the famous 8th Air Force in 1944, and he directed air combat operations through D-Day to the end of the war and winning the European theater, the final victory in the European theater. My husband, Robert, was a four-ranger bomber pilot in Doolittle's forces during those very dangerous years. I didn't know him then, but I'm glad he survived because I'm a happy woman now. Thank you, Robert. Our speaker tonight has represented the Doolittle family at air shows, aviation events, all across the country. Her articles have appeared in the Smithsonian Air and Space magazine and other publications. Also, she's chair of the Literary Guild of Orange County. Her book, Calculated Risk, was published last year and already has been nominated for the Colby Award. Calculated Risk is Joanna's attempt to keep the memory alive and accurate for both her indefatigable grandmother and her fearless grandfather. And it's on display here tonight. Joanna not only has done a great deal of research on the life of her grandfather, but she was there growing up with the Doolittle family as history was made. And it is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce our speaker this evening, Joanna Doolittle Hoppes. Joanna.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for the invitation to play with you guys tonight. A number of different organizations over the years has honored my grandfather, but he didn't join very many of them. And it was, it's quite an honor to be invited someplace where he actually was a member because of your reputation. Anyway, I wrote this book for a very specific reason. In 2000, I was at Hill Air Force Base with the Raiders on one of their reunions, and I was given a copy of the original script to the movie Pearl Harbor. And in that movie, in the original script, the character of Doolittle was written as a foul-mouthed, not-so-bright, patent stereotype. And I'm going to start off with a disclaimer right off the bat. We did get a hold of Disney. They were absolutely wonderful working with us to change that character and not be disrespectful. But we discovered two main things when we worked with them. The first was, once someone passes away, there is no way to protect their image. They become a part of public domain, and you can write or say anything you want about them. Now, we own the name. You can't make Jimmy Doolittle cookies, but you could do a movie or a book, and you can say pretty much what you want. That was the first thing. The second thing that I learned was the fact that even in my generation, there are a lot of people who don't have a clue who Jimmy Doolittle was. And it became my mission to do two things. The first thing was to put their story back out together, because my grandmother, I think, was just as much a part of history as my grandfather. And the second mission was to start talking to groups and to get people to record their stories. In other words, each and every one of you has a story. And if you don't record it, if it isn't written down, then it's going to disappear. So my mission is twofold, the first and the second. So who was Jimmy Doolittle, and why would I care, if his image is kept correct? He was born in Alameda, California, and when he was born in 1896, and shortly after his birth, his father took off for Nome, Alaska. He followed the gold up there. My great-grandmother took my grandfather up in 1900 when he was 4 years old. Now, a couple of things happened. He had these long, beautiful ringlets when he was up there, and he was a little bitty guy. He used to tell us that's when he was a little girl with these curls. But when he was up there, he was the really small kid, and he was the target of bullies. And one of the things that happened to him was he learned very quickly to defend himself with his fists. He got so good at it that it wasn't too long before anybody who wanted to join that group of kids in Nome had to fight Doolittle. And you never beat him. He was really very quick with his fists. Another thing happened in Nome that really, it set a tone for his life. Now, anybody teach school in here? Okay. Well, you know that imaginary line that teachers draw? Well, Jimmy was the kid that had both toes resting on it. He never really crossed it, but he had both toes firmly planted. One of the things he did was he drew this caricature of the principal, and it wasn't flattering. When he was caught for it, or the teacher found it, she made him stay after school, and his punishment was to write on the board 25 times, "Jimmy Doolittle is the smallest boy in school." Now, he told me he didn't know if it was the first time he wrote that sentence or if it was the 25th time that he wrote that sentence. But he decided that his size would never stop him from doing the things in life that he wanted to do. Now, personally, I think he was pretty successful with that. In 1908, my great-grandmother, Rosa, decided that Nome wasn't the place to raise Jimmy. And she came back down to Los Angeles. In fact, he went to high school at Manual Arts High School right here in town. And he pretty much grew up here. This is where a good portion of his life was. Now, that boxing thing that he learned when he was in Nome, he kind of perfected that. He actually became a professional boxer during his high school years. He boxed under the name of Jimmy Pierce. Now, you couldn't really make money boxing, so he used to win this gold watch, and then he'd sell it back to the promoter for $30, and then he'd win it again and sell it back. That's how he had money to buy a motorcycle. Well, his mom helped him with the motorcycle because she figured if she gave him a motorcycle, he'd stop boxing. No, didn't happen. He was a C student. I don't think many of you knew that. He wasn't really academically inclined in high school, not too interested. He had started gymnastics during the early years when he was in Nome. During those long winters, he spent time in the gyms practicing all these gymnastic tricks, which got him in trouble later, and we'll talk about that. He continued that in high school. He was on the pyramid team, and he was just kind of, he was very friendly. He was very popular. He had a lot of friends in high school. He had a lot of friends outside of high school in kind of this boxing world. But something happened to him in high school. He met this young lady, and her name was Josephine Elsie Daniels. Now, Josephine, she went by Jo, J-O-E, just like her uncle. She was a straight-A student. She was the secretary of her class. She was a Meridian, which is kind of the equivalent of a Phi Beta Kappa now. And she was an amazing woman. Just amazing. She had a photographic memory, and just everything about her was just grand. She was just this wonderful woman. And so Jimmy wanted to date her. So he asked her out, and she kind of looked at him and explained that nice girls didn't ride on the back of motorcycles. He didn't like no. Wasn't his favorite word. So he pursued her all through the early years of high school. He pursued her. And eventually they started dating, and he asked her to marry him. And she explained to him that that wouldn't work because her mother would never approve. And for him, that wasn't an issue because he didn't want to marry her mother. And so it was a relationship that grew from that. Now, it was during these high school years that they made a bargain that, in my heart, I think changed the course of history. Joe's uncle was a lawyer here in Los Angeles, and he offered to send her to law school and give her a position in his firm. She easily had the grades and the intellect to do it. Jimmy didn't want to marry a lawyer. And Joe, on the other hand, really had no interest in marrying a professional boxer. So they made a bargain. He would give up boxing if she would give up law. And after their bargain, he decided to go on back up to Alaska, where he was going to pick up gold off the beaches and come back with enough money to marry her. Well, he learned a couple things. First of all, there wasn't gold on the beaches anymore. His father still lived up there. He had moved down to Seaward, Alaska. And little backtracking here, his father didn't really chase the gold. His father grub-staked people who were looking for gold, but he himself actually was a carpenter. So my grandfather went up, and when he discovered that there wasn't gold on the beaches, he helped his father build a couple of houses and then took off for the streams where he did some panning for gold. He came back knowing that he needed to have an education and that he didn't want to eat salmon three times a day for the rest of his life. So he decided to come back to California and go to school. He went to the junior college, the community college here in Los Angeles, spent 2 years in community college, and then went up to UC Berkeley, where he decided to study engineering or mining engineering. He completed his sophomore year at UC Berkeley, and then the war started. He dropped out of school, and he enlisted in the Signal Corps, the Army Signal Corps, as a flying cadet. He stayed up in Berkeley that first period of time as to get his ground school out of the way. And on his way down from Berkeley to San Diego, where he was going to do his flight school, he stopped off to marry my grandmother. Now, this was 1917, and she was forbidden to marry him. Her father said that he would never amount to anything, so they literally eloped on Christmas Eve. Now, he hadn't even received his first paycheck yet. So she paid for the license, and they headed off to the courthouse, and they were married by a county clerk. Now, when they walked out of the courthouse, there was a woman on the steps, and she was really afraid. You know, obviously she was homeless. She didn't have any money. She didn't have any food. And my grandmother opened her purse, and she pulled out 50 cents, and she pressed it into this woman's hands. And my grandfather took one look at her. He said, "Joe, we don't have $20 between us. What are you doing?" And she goes, "Shh, Jimmy, that'll bring us luck." Now, I don't know if it brought them luck or not, but I do know that epitomized my grandmother. My grandmother did the right thing and the kind thing and the gracious thing without ever having to think about it. It was so much a part of her soul and who she was. My grandfather continued down to San Diego, and she stayed up in Los Angeles. She went to work for the shipyards. And as Granddad went down and learned how to fly, she continued to make money. Well, this wasn't the first time that she became kind of that rudder in his life. He was a little bit, you know, that toe on the line thing I told you in high school and elementary school? It followed him. By the time he was in flight school, and he was taught to fly by a guy named Charles Todd, he did those acrobatic things on the wings of airplanes. He used to climb in that airplane, and he and a friend, John McCulloch, would take off, and they'd get out of sight of the airfield, and he would climb out on the wings and do handstands or whatever he decided to do. And one day in particular, John expected him to get back in the plane. They were getting pretty low on gas, and so he expected Jimmy to get back in. But instead of getting in the plane, Jimmy climbed down between the wheels, and he sat on the struts while John landed. Now, John wasn't happy because this is going to surprise you, but that was a no-no. With military planes, you weren't supposed to do that. Well, what neither of them knew at the time was one of the other members of the Adventurers Club was there making a film. A guy by the name of Cecil B. DeMille was filming at the airstrip on that day. And he was really good friends with the villain in the story. Now, the villain in the story was a guy named Colonel Burwell, who was the commanding officer at the base. And Cecil B. DeMille and Burwell were sitting in the office that afternoon watching the rushes from the film. And the part came with this kid or this person landing between the wheels, and Burwell jumps up, he throws open his office door, and he yells out, "Ground Doolittle." DeMille looks at him and he goes, "You can't see the guy's face. How do you know it's Doolittle?" Burwell goes, "Nobody else is that stupid." Shortly after that, they asked my grandmother to move down to San Diego. They set up house for the first time down in San Diego in the town. They had a little 3-bedroom house, and they rented out 2 of the bedrooms and the garage to make the rent payments. And from the second that my grandmother moved down there, I call it in the book The Pilot's Lounge, but it really wasn't that. It was more than that. Anybody who had anything to do with aviation hung out at their house. I mean, that's where you went. I don't think it's because my grandmother brewed beer, but it might have helped. In fact, she told a story. They were down on the border in Texas, and my grandmother was very pregnant with my uncle at the time. And she had to get up and go to the restroom in the middle of the night. So she wove her way through the little living space where there were pilots and mechanics sleeping everywhere, got into the bathroom, and there was a pilot asleep in the tub. That's what the Doolittle house was like. Now, I told you that he didn't finish UC Berkeley, but the Army Air Corps sent him to 2 schools. The first school they sent him to was mechanics school, and that's really great because he loved taking those airplanes apart and putting them back together. He wanted to know everything about anything. I mean, he loved to work with his hands. He loved to build things. He was just this amazing brain when it came to that. The other thing they sent him to right at that same time was parachute school, and I in particular am really glad they did that because it saved his life at least 3 times. So I'm, before I was born. Very glad he did that. The next school they sent him to was an engineering school. It was the first, it made him really an odd duck because back in that day you had pilots and everybody knew that pilots were crazy. And you had engineers and everybody knew that engineers were just not pilots, right? So Gramps was one of the first people who kind of blended those 2 things together. He was a pilot, so he knew what he wanted an airplane to do, and he was an engineer, so he knew what an airplane could do or what a design could do. It made him kind of one of those people that blazed that trail. In 1922, he set his first record. Now, he set a coast-to-coast record from Pablo Beach, Florida, to San Diego, California. Now, I have a great picture of him on the beach with hundreds of people, and he's in the airplane and he's about to take off. Well, that picture isn't the first time he did it. What happened was he announced it to the world. He was going to do this, right? And he climbs in that airplane and he revs it up and he takes off down the beach and he hits a soft spot in the sand and he flips the plane over. And when he found out that he wasn't drowning because it was only calf deep and got out of the plane, this woman ran up to him and she said, "Jimmy, are you okay?" And he said, I'm fine, but my feelings aren't. What came out of that was the fact that he never attempted a record without making sure he could do it first. About a week later, that same plane, that same beach with his mechanic and no one else on the beach, he took off and he flew from Pablo Beach to Texas, to San Antonio, Texas, and then on to Rockwell Field in San Diego. He did it in 22 hours and 22 hours and 30 minutes. The elapsed time, the actual flying time, was 21 hours and 18 minutes. Now, this was the first coast to coast. Right after that, the Army Air Corps offered to send him to school, to MIT. Now, I told you he didn't have his degree, but those 2 courses that they sent him to, they were year-long courses. Berkeley recognized those and gave him his Bachelor's of Science. He then had 2 years to complete his master's. In 1 year at MIT, he completed his master's. In that second year, he completed his PhD in aeronautical engineering. He earned the first degree ever given by MIT in aeronautical engineering. Now, my grandmother, she didn't really have too much to do at that time. She had a toddler and an infant, and that was all, and a little bitty apartment. And when he would come home from school, he would bring her notes for her to type up. And she had a special typewriter that had the mechanical keys or the mathematical keys on it. And so she'd put the kids to bed, and then she would type his notes, and then she would quiz him on his notes. He always said that she had earned that degree as much as he did. Those notes that she typed up, they became the first textbook that MIT used for aeronautical engineering. Every step of the way, she was the partner. In 1925, Jimmy Doolittle won the Schneider Cup race. Now, what was unique about that was the Schneider Cup is a seaplane race, and he'd never flown a seaplane before. He'd never taken off, flown, or landed a seaplane. He had less than a month to train. He not only beat out the international competition, bringing the Schneider back to the United States, he also beat out a couple of Navy pilots, and they got ribbed really a lot over that. He also set the world seaplane speed record by changing the pitch of the propeller. In 1927, Jimmy Doolittle completed the first outside loop. We might not think too much of that now, but what the outside loop is, it's when you start out on level flight and you take a steep dive, you then have inverted flight, and then you climb back up to normal flight. What happens during that is the G-force on the pilot. He's being forced out of the seat, and all of the blood is being forced to his head. We didn't know if a pilot could survive it, and we didn't know if an airplane could survive that particular maneuver at the time. Now, Jimmy, the first time he did it, and the press saw it, they came up to him and they were really excited. They go, "Jimmy, you just did an outside loop." He goes, "Yep, just thought I'd try it." Remember that Pablo Beach story? Jimmy actually had about 6 months to prepare for that particular maneuver. Now, the reason he had 6 months was a story that had to do with gymnastics that I told you I'd tell you about. Okay, this is going to surprise you guys, but pilots have this camaraderie that bridges any national barrier. You guys didn't know that, right? You just all get along wherever you're from. And Jimmy was given this really tough job by the Army Air Corps. He had to go down to South America and fly the Curtiss Wright Hawk in demonstrations. You feeling sorry for him? Anybody in his crew would have wanted to do that. He was on loan to Curtiss Wright, and he went down to Santiago, Chile. And they were in the officers' club. You guys ever hear of pisco sours? Yeah, Granddad said never drink them. They were down in Santiago, Chile, and this is about the time that Douglas Fairbanks was so popular. And I mean, he was just the idol. And these these officers from Chile, they were just amazed by Douglas Fairbanks, how these flips and things that he could do. And Jimmy looked at him, he said, any American boy can do that. Well, they said, prove it. So he handed his drink to Boyd Sherman, who was his mechanic, and he did a couple handstands and flips and, walked across the room, and everybody cheered for him. They thought that was pretty great. And then one of them looked at it and said, yeah, that's fine, but Douglas Fairbanks does it on the windowsill. Gramps had this amazing one-hand plant. He would plant his hand, and then he would extend his body parallel. So he climbed out on the windowsill, and he planted his hand, and he extended his body out over the courtyard. And the windowsill gave way. Everybody knows that a good gymnast lands on his feet. Just happened that it was 2 stories down. And he broke both of his ankles. And, of course, they took him to the hospital and casted both of his legs. And he's laying in that bed in Santiago, and he's feeling pretty rotten. I mean, any other guy on his crew would have just jumped to demonstrate planes in Chile. And he started thinking about the commanding officer that had put his faith in him. And then he started thinking about the gentleman from Curtis Wright who had depended on him to demonstrate the Hawk down and sell it. They were actually trying to sell it to the different militaries. And he felt pretty low. He was feeling pretty bad about it. So he did what I'm certain every single person in this room would have done. He had Boyd bring a hacksaw to the hospital and cut the cast down low, and then he pulled his boots over the cast, and he put clips on the bottom of his boots, and Boyd took him out to the airplane, and he climbed in, and he clipped his feet to the rudders, and he took off. Did a few snap rolls to the right, and he could hear the cast crumble. Next day he went out and he did the snap rolls to the left, and he could hear that cast go. So he went back to the hotel then, and he soaked off both the casts and went back to the hospital, and they looked at him and they said, crazy American, go home. So Boyd found a gentleman in Santiago, a German fellow, who made artificial limbs. And this by using corset stays, which probably none of you know were instruments of torture for women. Using corset stays, they made casts for him, and he clipped his feet to the rudders, and he took off, and he not only outflew all of the international competition, he did get the contract for Curtis Wright, for the military. He then flew over the Andes. Now, he did that without a parachute because there was absolutely no way he could have gotten out of that airplane, and no way he could have survived in the mountains without with 2 casts on. So he flew over there. Well, Chile wasn't getting along with Bolivia, and they figured he was a spy, so he left very quickly, got back to the United States, and was sent to the hospital, where he had 6 months to recover. During that 6 months, he began to study the outside loop. He began to prepare himself physically. The minute he could get in the airplane, he kept pushing it over further and further and further until he did it. He did it a number of times before he did it for a friend. He did it for a number of friends before he did it for the press, where he just thought he'd do it. A little bit of time. Back in the 20s and 30s, the biggest problem that pilots had was flying in any kind of weather. I mean, you could almost count on if there was any weather you A, were grounded, or B, you weren't going to get to the ground the way you wanted to. So I asked him once what he felt was his greatest contribution. And he told me the blind flight. He was appointed by a guy named Jerry Land to head the full flight laboratory. This laboratory the bill was footed by Guggenheim. And he pulled together a crew of people, including Elmer Sperry, and they developed the first instruments so that they could fly, in any kind of weather. Again, the day that record was set was not the first time he did it. He tested those instruments a number of times in fog, to make sure they worked before they ever called Guggenheim out and said, hey, look what we can do. The night of that first flight, which was in 1929, I lied to somebody earlier. I said it was 32. It was 1929 that he did the first blind flight. The night of that particular flight, they had a party at their house, and I think this party, it typifies the Doolittles and what it was like in their home. Now, if you had a title, or you had money, or you had a rank or celebrity or anything else, when you went to the Doolittle house, you left that at the door, and you came in that door as an equal. So you would have Harry Guggenheim with his millions sitting next to Jack Dalton, who was the mechanic on the crew, and they were equal at that table. And that was the thing I remember growing up, the most remarkable thing about their home. I met incredible people, wonderful, amazing, just wonderful people. And some of them happened to be well-known celebrities, but the common denominator was just the caliber of people that they called their friends. It had nothing to do with anything but the inside of the person. That night, my grandmother took out a tablecloth, this white damask tablecloth, and starting with Jerry Land, who pulled the group together, she had him sign it. And then anybody who ever broke bread at their house signed either that tablecloth or the napkins, and then eventually screens. Every one of those names she embroidered in black silk thread. That tablecloth is a virtual who's who, not just of aviation, but of history. It was gifted to the Smithsonian. It's not on display now, but we're hoping that eventually they'll have a way to display it where it won't be damaged. In 1930, after 14 years as a lieutenant, my grandfather got out of the military and went to work for Shell Oil. Now, somebody asked me once if my grandparents or my grandmother's parents ever forgave her for marrying him. No, they never really forgave her. However, they did let him support them. And he was supporting both her parents and his mom. So he went to work for Shell Oil. And his job, you guys are going to feel sorry for him. His job for Shell Oil was to fly around in airplanes and show what they could do, what Shell Oil could do. Tough job, huh? You're feeling bad? One of the things he had to do when he was working for Shell was race airplanes. In 1931, he raced in the Bendix Trophy. Now, this was a cross-country race, and not only did he win that race, he also set the next record, coast-to-coast record, in under 12 hours. This was 11 hours and 11 minutes. Now, in that race, he flew a plane called the Laird Super Solution, and he loved that airplane. He just thought it was the greatest airplane. What happened was they decided that they could make the Laird faster. So they went to Matty Laird and they decided that they would make retractable landing gear and tweak this and tweak that. And so they did that. And Granddad took her up for her test flight, and he went to retract the landing gear, and he got it part way up. He went to put the landing gear back down. He got it part way down, go 3 clicks up, 3 clicks back, and that's it. So he said one of the saddest things he ever had to do was fly around over that field until he burned up enough gas and then take her in on her belly. Of course, with the landing gear stuck the way it was, she was completely destroyed. She was not flyable for the Thompson Trophy. What happened then was the fact that the Granville brothers, who built this fast little airplane, she was called the GB Racer. She was the fastest plane in the world at the time. They had an airplane, but they didn't have a pilot. Their pilot was in the hospital having flown one of their other airplanes. And there was this pilot, Jimmy Doolittle, who was kind of a good pilot by then, who didn't have an airplane. So the Granville brothers got a hold of him and said, "Hey, Jimmy, would you like to fly the GB?" And he agreed, and he went to pick her up in Springfield. He had this signature that he would do over a field anytime he took off. Well, he climbed in the GB and he didn't do his little signature run. He flew her straight to Cleveland and landed. And the next day he took her up, and he took her up pretty high because she didn't feel. He used to call her the little airplane that liked to fly upside down and backwards. He went up high to do a pylon turn, and she flipped on him. So he won the Thompson Trophy by flying in a circle. He didn't do the pylon turns. He just flew around in a circle. Now, the interesting thing about this particular race, the Thompson Trophy, was everybody knew the GB was a killer. I mean, just the December before that, Lowell Bales had been flying a GB, and there was a very fiery crash. It was caught on film. And so the press was pretty sure that Jimmy Doolittle was going to go in. They were so sure that they kept a camera on my grandmother, they kept a camera on my dad, and they kept a camera on my uncle. And when my grandfather won the race, and he landed, and he found out that the press had followed his family, he quit racing. He never flew another closed-circuit race after that. He felt that he had done as much as he could for racing, and that racing, in his opinion, had done as much as it could for the country. He continued to set coast-to-coast records. He continued to set city-to-city records and passenger flight records and all of those things, but he never flew another air race per se. Now, he owned one airplane. It was called the Doolittle 400. And this was really between the Bendix and the Thompson. And this was the old mystery ship that Shell had owned and had been cracked up. I think it was Jim Wendell broke her up a little bit. So Granddad bought her, and he tweaked her. She was just fine. She was a really great machine. And everybody was out there. All the guys that worked at the airport were out there too. Or it wasn't an airport, I lied. It was a field. They were all out there to watch Jimmy do the test flight, and he took that airplane up, and she was so fast. She was really great. And her wings came off, both of them. He bailed out with just enough room to land safely. I mean, he was so low, they don't even know how the chute opened. That's one of the pictures I have that I'll show you someday of him bailing out of that. Now, my uncle was there with him, and he walked up to the plane, and he saw that, Granddad was standing there, his chute in his arms, and I'm not sure if there were tears on his face, but there could have been. It was the only plane he ever bought. And my uncle looked at me, he goes, "Dad, how much money did we have wrapped up in that crate?" And my granddad goes, "All of it." And my uncle goes, "Boy, is Mom going to be mad." Jimmy Doolittle is best known for the Tokyo raid. In 1942, he led 16 bombers and 80 men off the deck of the Hornet. Now, the biggest myth about this raid is the fact that it was a suicide mission. The Tokyo raid was never a suicide mission. They knew the science behind it. My grandfather had his PhD from MIT. He knew what those planes could do. He knew that you could take it off a carrier. He knew that you could bomb Japan. The planes were scheduled to be landed in China and turned over to Chenault and the Flying Tigers. What happened that changed that was the fact that they were spotted 250 miles further off the coast of Japan than they had gas, or than they originally intended. Think about it. Pearl Harbor had suffered massive losses just 4 months before. We had 2 aircraft carriers on that task force. They couldn't afford to lose those carriers. The Doolittle crew had 2 choices. They either pushed those ships off into the ocean and let the fighters come up and protect the fleet, or they took off. And to a man, every one of them decided that's exactly what they wanted to do. They took the tins that they put oil in. Jerry cans were too heavy. So they took the tins that they had oil in the kitchen, and they filled them with gas. They had a bladder a rubber bladder that filled the walkway of the plane. Those planes took off filled with gas. They were completely filled with gas. They took off, they hit their targets in Japan, and then they headed for China. 15 of them headed for China. One of them headed for Russia. They did land in Russia, and they were promptly interned for 14 months. They escaped after 14 months. I think the Russians kind of turned their heads. But there's a photograph of my grandfather sitting on the hillside in China. He's sitting above the wing of his B-25, and he's about the lowest that he's ever been. The picture's taken by Paul Leonard, and Paul was his crew chief. And Paul said to him, he goes, boss, he said, they're going to make you a general. And Granddad looked at him and he said, they're going to take my airplane away. And Paul looked at me and said, boss, they're going to give you the Congressional Medal of Honor. And Gramps said, they're going to give me a vacation at Leavenworth. And then Paul said to him, he said, boss, they're going to give you another airplane. And when they do, I want to fly with you. And my grandfather said that was the highest compliment he'd ever received. Here he was, sitting around on a hillside above the pieces of his plane. And here's this man that said, I want to fly with you. Well, Paul was right. He was promoted to general before he left China. He was also awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. He didn't go to Leavenworth. You guys knew that anyway. Anyway, and Paul did become his crew chief. Paul did go over to North Africa with him. And when he went over to North Africa, he was killed protecting their planes. But there's something about that. My grandfather never felt that he had earned that Congressional Medal of Honor. He always felt that, well, in fact, he told Marshall and he told Arnold that he didn't feel that he should get it. And they both argued with him. They said they thought he had. And so he told Roosevelt when he accepted the medal, I accept this on behalf of all of the Raiders. And our family and all of the Raiders and anyone who knows my grandfather knows that it's their medal, not his. That medal now is at the University of Texas in the Doolittle Library. The one thing about the raid, let me catch up just a minute on that. 2 of the men drowned on the raid. 1 of them was killed on bailing out. 8 of them were captured by the Japanese. Of those 8, 3 were executed by firing squad, and 1 died of malnutrition. 4 of them came home. There's an amazing book by C.V. Glines, and by that title, 4 Came Home. And it talks about what these men went through when they were captured and held by the Japanese. Of those 4, George Barr died a number of years ago, but 3 of them are still alive. There are only 16 Raiders alive, and 3 of them were POWs from Japan. They are absolutely amazing. Another side note, of those 3, Jake DeShazer, who spent his time in prison, then went back to Japan as a missionary, and he spent his entire adult life as a missionary in Japan. Amazing, an absolutely amazing man. Now, side note, I asked my Gramps one time what was the hardest job he ever had, and he felt that was convincing Ike Eisenhower that Doolittle should be on his staff. When Marshall called Eisenhower and said, hey, who would you like for the North African campaign? Would you like Jimmy Doolittle? Eisenhower said, nope. Want Spatz, Frank, or Acre, in that order. And Marshall goes, well, you can have anybody you want, but we think you should take Doolittle. Well, Doolittle went. You kind of don't tell General Marshall, I don't think I'll take him. Anyway, he did go with Eisenhower, and Eisenhower had that image of him remember that sort of, oh, I just thought I'd do it on the spur of the moment, the daredevil pilot? He didn't recognize the other side of him, the side that was the scientist, the side that was, a little bit more grounded. So it took him a while. There is a story of one time when Gramps was up in a Spitfire and Eisenhower was looking for him, and finally he got a hold of him and he said, Jimmy, you've got two choices. You can be a lieutenant and fly a Spitfire, or you can come with me and command the 8th Air Force. He decided to go with Eisenhower. He formed and commanded the 12th Air Force in North Africa. He then formed and commanded the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean. And then he was given the 8th Air Force. Now, the interesting thing about the 8th Air Force, he had very mixed emotions about it. I mean, it was the Air Force. It was the plum. But his friend, Ira Aker, had built that Air Force. He took it from scratch, and he built it into the mightiest Air Force in the world. And here it was, and given the opportunity to do what it could do, and Ira was kicked upstairs. So my grandfather always had kind of mixed emotions about that. But it was an amazing, amazing command. And a couple of things that happened during that command. Now, he wasn't, not all of his decisions were popular. There were 3 decisions he made in particular that I usually hear about anytime I do anything with veterans. The first was he took the number of missions. There were 25 missions when Gramps got there for the bombers. He moved that to 30 and then to 35. The reasoning behind that was about 20 missions. You guys were good. They really knew what they were doing. So they had 5 missions of really being together. They found that by increasing the number of missions with the experience, even the inexperienced planes and pilots were coming home. There was a greater survival rate. The second thing he did kind of irritated the ground troops, and I hear about that too. He changed the mission of the Air Force from tactical to strategic. His feeling was if you took the enemy out, the ground troops were going to be safer. And the third decision that he made that really impacted a lot of people was he released the fighters. Now, the bomber pilots were not happy about that. When he got there, the mission of the fighters was to protect the bombers. What he said was the mission of the fighters is to take out the enemy. And the minute he released the fighters, their mission was then to seek out enemy planes either in the air or on the ground. Now, Adolf Galland, the German ace, was visiting my parents' house shortly before my grandfather died. And his comment was that decision ended the Luftwaffe when our fighters were released and then began to really take off. A little side note here about the kind of commander he was. He was very, very well loved by his men. And the reason was he commanded by saying, not you go do it, but let's go do it. When he commanded the 8th, frequently he would show up at one of the fields at random, his parachute on his back, and tap somebody on the shoulder and say, hey, how would you like the day off? He would take any position but pilot, and he would fly with his crews until he had intelligence that they wouldn't let him do that anymore. But that was something that he really liked doing. And you never knew. I was talking with one of the raiders who flew for him in England, and he said he never picked the best pilot. He never picked the best plane. He frequently would take the tail in Charlie. It was just whatever. He was there to do it. He was the kind of man that anything he asked of you, it was what he was willing to do himself. He had tremendous integrity, and he was very humble. I received a letter not long from a gentleman who was in Okinawa with my grandfather. He called it Camp Mud. He said that there was a mess hall tent, and it was enlisted and officers that all ate together. And what you did was you ate with your mess kit, and then you had to go outside, and there was a barrel right outside the door, and you washed your mess kit. And he said he was sitting there, he was washing his mess kit, and turned to hand the brush to the next guy in line. He said the next guy in line was your grandfather. He said here he was, 3 stars on his shoulder, waiting his turn to wash his own mess kit. That was Gramps. That was Gramps. That was who he was. He loved adventure. He did all Big Five in the African Big Five. He had all, I think it was that called, he had all of the different trophies. He also had the Grand Slam. He did a lot of hunting, a lot of fishing. He also, Pearl Harbor, when they were making the movie, they asked us if we would give them some memorabilia for his vanity wall. My grandfather never had a vanity wall. If you were to visit his office, whatever company he was with, it was their pictures on the wall. It was never him. If you wanted to see his trophies, if you wanted to see his memorabilia, you had to know him well enough to be invited into his home. Now, he lived here in Santa Monica, just down off Ocean on Margarita. And the house looks like a white castle. And the whole length of the house, the bottom basement, ran, the full length, and all of the trophies lined this basement. I mean, the Thompson was there, all his elephant, his polar bears, the Congressional Medal of Honor, all of them are there. Now, this is the thing that got me, was that's where he taught us how to shoot pellets. There was a pellet range at the one end of the basement, and a bar at the other end. And so all 5 of us, learned how to shoot pellet guns. And when I think now, the Thompson was sitting right on the mantle, right above the fireplace, right in that room. So, I mean, he was just really unique that way. Another part of their house in Santa Monica, we called it the Rogues Gallery, and the hallway of the house was lined with pictures. They were 5x7 pictures, black and white, and they were signed by everyone who visited their house now, or that they knew. They had Winston Churchill and all of the Raiders, anybody that you would think of. Now, when I was in Oshkosh last summer, we stayed in a house locally, and the man next door was dying of cancer, and he asked if my cousin Jimmy and I would come over. So we went over to visit him, and he told me this story. He said when he was a little boy, he was their paper boy, my grandparents' paper boy, and anytime he came to collect for the paper, my grandparents would invite him in, and they'd offer him, cookies and milk. And then he said he would walk down this hallway, and he would point at the pictures and ask my grandfather the stories. And that's my memory of walking down that hallway and seeing these pictures and hearing the stories of these absolutely, incredible people. My grandparents were a partnership. They were a team in everything they did, every step of the way. When my grandfather was asked if he would ever like to live his life again, he said no, for 2 reasons. He said he could never be so lucky again. And when they asked him, well, what was the luckiest thing that ever happened? He said, when Joe married me. My grandmother suffered a stroke in 1984 that robbed her of the ability to speak and the ability to walk. At that point in time, my grandfather was still on the road at least, 3/4 of the time. From the day she had her stroke, he never left her side, with the exception of one time, and that was to go and get his 4th star. They worked as a team in everything they did. And when she passed away on their 71st wedding anniversary to the day. I'd like to close by reading something to you that was from my grandfather's autobiography. In my 9+ decades, I have formed some views about life and living. I have concluded that we were put on this earth for a purpose, That purpose is to make it, within our capabilities, a better place in which to live. We can do this by painting a picture, writing a poem, building a bridge, protecting the environment, combating prejudice and injustice, providing help to those in need, and in 1,000 other ways. The criteria is this: if a man leaves this earth a better place than he found it, then his life has been worthwhile. Thank you. Now that I've destroyed your stage, ask if there are any real quick questions. Any real quick questions? You've got just a couple minutes. Yes, sir. He died, he was 96, almost 97. He died in 1993 in September. Sir. I love him. Yes. Yep.
Face to face. What's the hardest part of leadership? Your grandfather was famous for being a leader by example, and your grandfather said it's the toughest part is being a leader through delegation, and that was when he was the general of the 8th Air Force.
It was kind of remarkable because Gramps was a straight shooter. He wasn't aligned with any political party. He didn't, really back any particular candidate other than Goldwater. But he did and said the right thing, and it didn't matter who you were. He wasn't going to change who he was. And one of the letters to my grandmother, he wrote something along the line that I'm learning to keep my mouth shut with my superiors, but I will never learn how to blame my subordinates. So anyway, thank you. Let me turn this back over to you.